one of the big problems that the Catholic Church had, and I'm trying to understand the scriptures, is modernity. Believe it or not, when I was in the seminary, twice I had to take anti-modernist oaths. I had to actually swear before God, with my hand on the Bible, that modernism was a problem for the church, and we should see that modernism should be just put to the side, and if we can do it, get rid of it completely. We wouldn't say that today. But between us as friends, I think Islam is going through that very reality today. It too is wrestling with modernity. And in a wonderful book called The Theology of Tariq Ramadan, my friend Gregory Baum, who just died this year, he says that Islam is going through the same evolution that the Catholic Church went through with modernity. So we're going through this together. That's one of the wonderful things. And when we talk again about chosenness and election, well, we have a lot of things to say about it, but in the time of Constantine, what happened was that we had one religion. It was the Catholic religion, and that was it. And so anybody who wasn't Catholic under the Constantinian rule just wasn't even accepted. So all of that was maintained because of this. The choice was made at that time between faith and reason. We chose faith. And when you choose faith, who gives you the certainty of the faith? The authorities. So when the authorities give a certainty of faith, you really are not able to use your head. You can't use your mind. You have to believe what has to be believed. In other words, beliefs are different from faith. And what happens is that when we see ourselves confronted that way, that existed in our tradition until 1962 with the Second Vatican Council. And most of what we deal with in terms of election of Jews and Israel and chosenness, wow, what a terrible history we have together. We not only had animosity towards Jews, you were going to hell. But it's okay, we said the Protestants were going as well, so it was okay. But, when the Council of Florence in the 16th century said that until the Jews convert to the church, they are going to hell. Written. And that attitude was continued right through, so that the church was the replacement of this poor Israel. We were the chosen ones. We were the ones elected. We were the ones that were going to take the place of Israel. Well, that worked because it led us to a very terrible history when we had inquisitions, when we had crusades, when we had killing of Jews, Muslims, even despite the axial age when Maimonides and St. Thomas Aquinas had dialogue. That was a little bit of a respite from those 2,000 years of animosity between who was chosen and who was elected. And when we ask ourselves what was chosen and who was chosen, I think we have to look to the scriptures. And that's why tonight, if you look at what was in bigger print so I can read it too, that in Genesis 12, 1 to 10, Yahweh said to Abraham, "Leave your country, your kindred, and your father's house for a country which I shall show you, and I shall make you a great nation. I shall bless you and make your name famous. You are to be a blessing." What a wonderful way to be able to say that this is a chosen people who have God's blessing. We didn't read the Old Testament, so we didn't hear this very well. We were the chosen ones because Jesus Christ changed all that. Jesus Christ was the discontinuity between Old Testament, Hebrew writings, and the Christian writings. Well, today we would say there's discontinuity, but the continuity, and although there are many theological problems that exist between Jews and Catholics and Christians, they're not insurmountable once we recognize that they're there. And we find out that those differences are minimal compared to the number of things that we have in common. And that continuity of the writings about Israel, the history of Israel, first and foremost tell us that God is a God of history. What we do with one another and how we do that with one another is what we discover about God. And Thomas Merton, the great monk who worked with Buddhist Catholic dialogue, said, really, when you get down to it, we tell each other a lot more about what we say about ourselves than what we say about God. That's where we start. We start with that history of election and choice without understanding Genesis as our starting point. And when in verse 3, he says, I will bless those who bless you, shall curse those who curse you, and all clans on earth will bless themselves by you. So Abraham went as God told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had amassed, and the people they had acquired in Haran. They set off to the land of Canaan and arrived there. History. A God of history. A God of history so that we as Christians and Jews have to find God in dialogue. There's no other way than to enter into history, than to speak with each other in total honesty about what it means to be elected and to be chosen. And so Abraham passed through the country as far as the holy place of Shechem, the oak of Moreh. The Canaanites were in the country at the time. Well, it depends if you read Judges or you read Joshua. One was an easy entrance into the promised land, and the other wasn't that easy. It was rather fearsome. And that's okay, because you see, God is never completely known. If he were completely known, we would never have had what we had. God is ineffable. He's just, when I was in the seminary, the first treatise we studied in theology was The Infinite God. Wow, it was so exciting that, as a Catholic boy going into the seminary to find out that God was infinite. And all of a sudden, for the next 4 years, they told me he wasn't. Told me exactly where he was, how he was, who he was, and how Jesus Christ was the only way that we could understand what that was all about. How can we start with something so infinite and end up with so closed a view? Because it's even with Christian writings that we will find out that we too are in the same history, the common history together of trying to disclose God in what we do to one another. I was just reading a book that a fellow wants to be published, and I was reviewing it today, and he says, what we've lost most today in his search for God is the golden rule. Do unto others what you would have them do unto you. Wow, have we even come close to that? Not when I read the history of the election and choice of Israel and the choice of Christianity. And God appeared to Abram and said, I shall give this country to your progeny. And there Abraham built an altar to God who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the mountains district east of Beth-El, where he pitched his tent with Beth-El to the west and Ai to the east. There he built an altar to Yahweh and invoked the name of God. Wanting again a place of worship, Beth-El and Ai. Eventually, with Israel and our ability to see what was happening in the divided kingdoms, when the kingdoms became united, we see Jerusalem as the center of worship. And all of those other ways of being able to see God kind of become confluent with Israel in that home of Jerusalem. And, when it says in verse 10, there was a famine in the country, and Abraham went down to Egypt to stay there for a time, since the famine in the country was severe, we know that that is a disclosure of what will happen in terms of Joseph, in terms of his brothers, and so much to learn about what we must do to become authentic believers. Trust in each other. We didn't do that. And we didn't do very well at that. And so I have a few texts that I will quote fairly quickly as soon as I find them. I actually dog-eared so I would find them quickly, and I see that my dog ears have abandoned me. But, the church was very difficult in understanding exactly what was happening. And when we see what the fathers of the church said about the Jews and about Israel, to me it's shocking. There's not even an openness to be able to reevaluate what's being said. And that's what really becomes more and more, here we are. Martin Luther on the Jews and their lies. What then shall we Christians do with this damned, rejected race of Jews? Since they live among us, and we know about their lying and blasphemy and cursing, we cannot tolerate them if we do not wish to share in their lies, curses, and blasphemy. In this way we cannot quench the inextinguishable fire of divine rage, nor convert the Jews. We must prayerfully and reverentially practice a merciful severity. Perhaps we may save a few from the fire and flames of hell. We must not seek vengeance. They are surely being punished 1,000 times more than we might wish them. Let me give you my honest advice. Pretty strong. I mean, I wouldn't want to be there at the wrath of God when that was going to take place. And as I've said to people, you know, when you send people to hell for eternity, it's a long time. A long time. And then you have, again, you know, St. Augustine, who also said, how hateful to me are the enemies of your scripture. How I wish that you would slay them, the Jews, with your two-edged sword, so that there should be none to oppose your world. Gladly would I have them die to themselves and live to you. So, you know, like, I mean, we've talked a lot about Augustine and his impact on our theology in many ways, with original sin and with his view of the Jews. Origen of Alexandria. We may thus assert in utter confidence that the Jews will not return to their earlier situation, for they have committed the most abominable of crimes in forming this conspiracy against the Savior of the human race. Hence the city where Jesus suffered was necessarily destroyed, the Jewish nation was driven from its country, and another people was called by God to be blessed in their election. I mean, you know, how much stronger can we be in seeing why Vatican II, Nostra Aetate, was just such a reversal of 2,000 years of a hateful relationship between the Catholic Church and the Jews. My friend Gregory Baum, who just died recently, as I mentioned to you before, he was one of the key people at Vatican II. He died at 94, so he was one of the key people at Vatican II to write Nostra Aetate. And, you know, Nostra Aetate begins with the simple questions. Why am I here? Why are we on earth? What we should do with one another? What's an afterlife about? I mean, these are the perennial questions all of us have to ask with every generation, because every generation, when it faces those questions, has to have a response. And our response was Nostra Aetate, reversing 2,000 years of relationship with Jews and people of other religions, and changing it to the point where we called for dialogue. Since Vatican II, I don't know, I haven't counted them, but I would say there have probably been 15 different documents that have been published by the church and promulgated by the church. The most recent one being Between Jerusalem and Rome, when all of the different segments of Judaism prepared a document, a very short document. You can't summarize it because it's that short. It's only 6 pages, and it really, for the first time, gathers together the Jewish people and their attitude toward the Catholic Church in a document from Jerusalem to Rome, and they handed it to Pope Francis together. We have made enormous strides towards dialogue. How far have we gone? How far will we go? Well, it's going to be up to us. I think we are the ones who have to be able to say to ourselves, what does it mean to be truly chosen, and what does it mean to have the similarity between Jews and Christians? There are some similarities between Jews and Christians on the thought and on the meaning of chosenness and divine election. And yet, from another point of view, there is considerable dissimilarity. The idea of chosenness is central to Christianity. A good case could be made for the view that divine election sums up the entire Christian message. Chosenness refers to the covenant, and both in the Jewish and Christian tradition, this implies divine initiative out of mercy. Just reading an article after Pope Francis being the Bishop of Rome for the past 5 years, and they said, how would you summarize his 5 years as Pope? And one person said, he will go down in history as being the Pope of mercy. And I think that that's probably true. He has opened the church. He said, let's go to the peripheries, Bring in the people from the peripheries, bring them to the center of the community, and let them understand God's mercy. Everything he does is about mercy. That's why when he interprets Scripture, he does it with this attitude of mercy. When it comes to people who otherwise have had difficulty in family life, and we've had 2 synods on the family, what he did was even, for the first time, put out the vote. So many bishops at the synod voted this way, and so many voted, and we lost that one, he said. But you know, that's who he was. He's challenging people to confront each other in mercy, to confront each other in dialogue, but not to be afraid to say what you have to say. We've never had that before. You know, it's usually been, as I said, since the 4th century, listening to the authorities to give us a certainty of faith. We'll talk to young people today. I am sure that in the Diocese of Montreal, where we claim there's over 1 million Catholics, nobody knows the name of the Archbishop. And certainly wouldn't know the name of his auxiliary bishops. Probably don't know where his office is. Probably have never read anything he said. Even with Pope Francis, I'm sure that many priests have not read everything that he's written. You know, we have to look at where young people are. They're not in our synagogues like they used to. Oh, high holidays. Yes, sorry. Erase. Easter's coming up. Oh, we're going to have a full church again. You know, and you know, Islam. My friend Zayed Dillis, you know, he said very clearly that the young people are not going to the mosques. Many of the imams are not speaking English like it's understandable. They're from other countries. They talk about back home. These kids are born Canadian. They're Canadian. They don't see back home. They've never understood back home. When they go to the mosque, people are saying, well, you shouldn't dress that way. You know, that's not very... And don't put your hair that way. I mean, that's not the way you should. Have more respect. If we do that often enough, young people won't come. And we do that too often. And we have not had the courage to be able to look at where we came from and how we became fixed in all our feasts in the Christian world around the agricultural cycles of nature. Everything. It's got to change. I mean, you know, when I say to a 12-year-old, have you ever been to a turkey farm? Yeah. My mom's freezer. That's the closest they ever come to a turkey farm. If you ever try to ask people, you know, a 12-year-old, when I was growing up, you planted the seed and God let it grow. Today, you plant the seed and the 12-year-old says, yeah, photosynthesis. My God. And then when we put God in heaven, because of the terrible world in which we lived in the industrialized age, we asked for his intervention. Didn't work. When I was chaplain in the high school, and all the kids would say to me, Father, I'm praying that my parents don't divorce. And they divorced, so that's the end of God for me. Or they go to church and they don't find anything that nourishes them except people saying, be quiet. Don't do that. Do this. You take it for a while and then you just say, that's enough, Mom. That's enough, Dad. I'm not going to church anymore. It's our fault. Nobody else's fault. I used to always say to my bishop, if you had 10 children and 9 of them didn't speak to you, who would you blame, the children or you? Today, 9 out of 10 Catholics in the French church do not speak to the church. And it's all our fault. It's our fault because we didn't understand election and chosenness. We're not apart from anybody. We too are searching. We too are looking for the meaning of being chosen by God in a world that is so desperate for our answers. And what's happened to us? We've been privatized. Oh, if you listen to everything that happens in Quebec, it's such a secular society, and when we had the Charter of Values, what was it saying? Oh, it's okay for you to be a Jew, yeah, in your home, and in the synagogue, that's fine. You'll be Christian, Catholic, yeah, in your church, in your family, but not in the public square. You can go to mosque and you can have an imam, but not out in the public square. We brought that upon ourselves. We weren't engaged in the world. So we are chosen, and our election is to become involved in the world. And that's why Pope Francis says, I want a church that's hurting and dirty and in the streets. That's not the image we had of the church. The church was the perfect place. The church was the perfect society. Today, Francis says, I prefer a church that's hurting and dirty and in the streets. I prefer a church, he says, of the poor for the poor. We were a church for the poor, but we weren't a church of the poor for the poor. He says we should be a field hospital where the wounded can come to us and be healed. He said we'll worry about the vital signs later. And the last one, he said, the church is like a mother who teaches us but has mud on her shoes in the streets. We have to become engaged in our world today. That's our chosenness and that's our election. As Jews, as Christians, as Muslims, and we are arriving late and out of breath. In the early period of the church in New Testament times, the young Christian community understood itself as the continuation of the people of Israel, and they applied their own self-understanding of the chosen people to themselves. They knew who was chosen, and they said, yeah, now we're the new Israel. We're the new Adam. Because they saw how powerful that covenant was. The Buri, a dear friend of mine, Dennis McCarthy, a Jesuit, wrote a book on treaty and covenant. And he wrote it because he said that the Protestants always felt that, nothing could be removed from original sin. Adam and Eve did it, and we are going to suffer from it throughout our humanity. And he said, that was the Lutherans who thought that, because the Lutherans thought that if you had original sin, the best you could do is cover it over, but it's never going to go away. And he says, Catholics, we said, even by baptism, you can get rid of it all. You can become a full human being again. So we can say to ourselves, our covenant, the covenant that we share. In the writings of Benedict XVI, especially in Dominus Jesus, there was that moment when I felt that he was saying there's only one covenant again. The Christian covenant, that the Jewish covenant was not respected again. He said that there were one true covenant, the Christian covenant with Jesus. But the covenant that was with the Jews was faulty, that the other Christian churches were faulty. But the wonderful reality is that now we have said it very clearly, that God has elected the people of Israel in a covenant that is irrevocable. It can never, ever, ever, ever not be recognized as an authentic covenant with God. And those two covenants, because of the fact that they're both authentic with the same God, require us to have dialogue with one another. In the second period after the New Testament times, from the early centuries until modern times, we became as a church much more interested in one's personal history and how I as an individual would work my way towards salvation. And in this context, election referred to God's gratuitous choice of his daughters and sons. The church concentrated more and more on the fate of individual Christians, on their salvation, their faith, their divine election. This emphasis on the individual lasted right up until modern times. There was a consciousness that the new age has broken in, and that eagerly expected that the return of Jesus to make an end of history altogether. The yearning for this end of days characterized the early church. And when the church became powerful and culturally successful, its views regarding the Jewish people had devastating effects, social and political effects. And so we can ask ourselves again, the way we formulate the covenant, the way we respect the covenant, and see that the covenant is irrevocable, and that it's here forever, and it's an everlasting one, as Jeremiah said, written on our hearts in chapter 31. So too, the New Testament will talk about our choice. And I chose Romans 11 to 23. 11 to 23, but you didn't get all of the verses prior to that. And one of the things that really comes out is that the whole of Romans, especially in that text, I'll just briefly read part of 11:1 to 3. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the scriptures say of Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel? Lord, they have killed thy prophets, they have demolished thy altars, and I am left alone, and they seek my life. You see, infidelity doesn't mean you can't be saved. That's the great message of the Old Testament. That even though there was fidelity upon infidelity, God was always merciful. God always heard the cry of the people. Even when they became depraved and he heard their cry and he forgave them. And so too with us today, we come to a point where we have to say to ourselves, in all of our situations, we rely on God's mercy. Yet at one time in our tradition, if somebody was dying, we waited for the very last moment that the person was going to die, and we gave them extreme unction, blessing with oil, so that they could get into heaven. Without being sacrilegious, it was almost like they were going to slide into heaven because they had oil on them, Doesn't work that way. And so now we have, not an extreme, it's anointing of the sick, asking God to bring them back to health. And bringing back to health so that they can be part of the community, so that the community will again be able to bring to the world that wonderful message of God's mercy. Wow, what a difference in terms of interpretation. What a difference in interpretation of what we thought baptism was. Baptism was making you a member of the church. Today it's making you a disciple, making you a follower of the community of faith, so that together in the community of faith we can actually change the world. And so what you have on your paper says, so I ask, have they stumbled so far as to fall? By no means. But through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Now I'm speaking to you, Gentiles, inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order to make my fellow Jews jealous, and thus save some of them. Jealousy is you have something that I want. And Paul knew that. That's why he quit being the person who persecuted the church and persecuted the people. Until his conversion on the road to Damascus, he was our enemy. And yet he can say, we can be here and we can see that we can be jealous of what the Jews have to offer us. Wow. Lionel and myself have had a great relationship. And I think that many times, I remember the last time when we had the Festival of Lights, and it was almost being jealous of each other's traditions. Wow, that's really great. Maybe we could do that too. Maybe you did that, but maybe I'm going to steal that idea from you always steal ideas that are good anyway. But there's a jealousy there that is so healthy. So healthy. But we tend to see that we don't give praise to those people who are successful. That's one of the problems that we have in all our religions, is that people who are successful just will not be praised because we're jealous of them. We don't take our best practices, we take our worst practices, and then we tell people that's terrible stuff. Yeah, but what about the best practices? My friend Father John Baxter, who's up at Holy Family, is now 82 or 83, and I was talking to him on the phone yesterday because I'm going to be preaching there at Easter, and he's so alive. So alive. He's alive, and in his church on the wall there's the Kotel and a quotation from the Talmud, and on the ceiling there's ropes everywhere for the web of life, and on one of the walls all the religions are there pointing in the same direction. And he has a big sign on the top of his church. It's so prophetic. Respect the religion of your neighbor. That's all it says. Respect the religion of your neighbor. That's courageous. That's prophetic. That's what we need to do. We need to be out there and say it. And when you walk into his church, in the vestibule, the wall is a wall of houses. Like you can't see the doors to get into church because they've all been painted with wallpaper of houses. And over it says, Pope Francis, church must be hurting and dirty and in the streets. So, there are creative ways for us to become prophetic, and maybe that's what we need to do. And so in verse 15 it says, if their rejection means a reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. I remember interviewing Dead Man Walking, Helen Prejean. And one of the things that she said was, she was on the north side of New Orleans when she started to do her ministry. And she said it was very nice and comfortable, it was suburbia, they had a nice little home, the sisters lived together, they would pray in the morning together, they made supper together, they'd pray at night together. It was such a comfortable life. And she said, I was transferred to the south side of New Orleans. And the first night there's a knock at the door, I open the door and this woman barges in and the man behind her has a knife, ready to kill her. And she said, that night, my God changed. That night, my God changed. And she then went on to write Dead Man Walking, and Susan Sarandon won an Oscar for it. And she is a very strong woman. And surprisingly, I went to interview her, and I said, my name is John Walsh. She said, Father John Walsh. I said, how would you know me? She said, well, you taught at Divine Word in London, Ontario, the year after I had left there, and so I've been following your career. Hello? Once in a while you say to yourself, can't I ever have a free moment that somebody doesn't know who I am? But the whole idea is that we have to come again to wholeness. Wholeness, and I just had a wonderful talk that I was listening to maybe 3 weeks ago about the fact that creation and the Big Bang Theory is about wholeness. Right from the very beginning. And I like the expression that God manifested himself 14.6 billion years ago. There's some way in which we have to be able to not find enemies, but find people who reinforce what needs to be said for today. And we must begin by ridding ourselves of the prophets of gloom and doom. Yes, there's major areas that we have to look at today and look at them together. There's 62 million refugees on the face of the earth. 62 million. How many migrants are there? And now we're putting up walls and we're rejecting them from 6 countries. I mean, all of these things should bother us. But I don't hear that the communities are out in the streets like we too, or me too. We don't want our faith out in the public. We don't want to stand up and say, that is not tolerable. Because we Canadians are very tolerant. We're very, very kind. Unfortunately. I think we have to be able to stand up as Jews and Christians and Muslims and people of faith, atheists. Wonderful, I just got this quote, a tweet. I don't know if you know, there's what's the word I'm looking for? A tweet on God. And you can actually go and they have tweets about God. So this is the one that came up today. I hope I can find it. I'm sure I can find it. Here we are. Here's the tweet of God. It's only been a few hours and Stephen Hawking already mathematically proved to my face that I don't exist. I think that what we have to be able to do is we also have to have our sense of humor. And so even when I look at people who are writing, who are not writing from an expression of faith, Tom Friedman being one of them, Michael Mendenbaum, when they quote Colonel Mark Mickleby in their conclusion, and this is what it says: at no time in our history have our national challenges been as complex and long-term as those we face today. But the most salient trait of our time is not threats posed by terrorists, an academic economy, or climate change. It's our inability to respond coherently and effectively to obvious problems before they become crises. If we cannot have an adult conversation How will we fulfill the promises of and our obligation to the preamble of our Constitution to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity? You know, there is a way in which we have to be able to say to ourselves that there's something that we have in common. And many of the issues that we have today are common problems, common history, and God is a God of history. And our election and our chosenness is to be part of that history. And we have to speak to that history. We have to be able to change that history when it, you know, the reign of God is what we're about. And that's one of the things that the church has discovered in our election and in our chosenness, is that the church today is a church that is not church-centered. We're gospel-centered. And the Jesus of the gospel is our center. And so what does Jesus say about it? Well, read the Beatitudes. He said, whatever you do to one of these, the least of my sisters and brothers, you do it to me. And that's how close God wants to be to us. Certainly in the Jewish faith, you know, everything I read, when you read about Yom Kippur, or you read about the day before, the songs of Kol Nidre, it's that deep sense of being able to come and to be involved because you can be forgiven every sin that you've committed. Men are held back. I'll be right with you.
Okay, it's just a definition.
Okay.
What are the Gospels?
What's that? The Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the New Testament writings.
Oh, okay.
And it's 4 different views of Jesus, and one would contradict the other if we really put them side by side, because they're written at different times by different people, different communities, for different reasons. So, but I mean, in the Christian readings, we have enough to tell us what we should be doing and how we should do it. Even though there's, you know, like God is ineffable. You're not going to be able to find somebody who explains God away to you. You can't do it. He's every time you think you know God, he just spooks you out. He just leaves you there and says, yeah, but what about that? What about that? Okay, let me give it another shot. Let me give it another try. Let me see what's going to happen. Let me see how I'm going to be able to do this. And so the Vatican Council really did tell us that we are all members of this whole reality of history. That our history is why we've been elected, why we've been chosen, to be able to face the issues. What are the issues we face today? Food distribution. 15 years on CJAD, I can tell you that the number one problem in Montreal is still food. We don't have enough food. Moisson Montreal, that was started by my friend Fred Sawyer, today has 250 agencies on the waiting list. When Fred started the first year, he said to me, I was so happy. I think 75,000 pounds of food in the first year. Now they're giving tons of food per day. And they have 285 agencies waiting to be on the list. Food, children going to bed hungry. If it weren't people like Generations and the Petit Déjeuner, not numbers, majority of kids go to school without breakfast. In our city. Food distribution in the world. We have enough food to feed the people of the world. Look at what we throw away. You know, if you conserved what you had in terms of money, we would be able to feed the world easily. But we don't do it. When it talks, you know, I was supposed to be in South Africa, and I didn't go to South Africa because of the water shortage and the internal heat that they're going through. The whole city, by May, might have to actually be evacuated because they don't have water. And it's brought on because of our inability to deal with what our God-given natural resources are. When number one problem in the world is water. Another problem is, you know, climate change. Anybody who denies climate change, but what are we doing about it as religious people? What were we chosen to do? What were we elected to do in this world today with the issues of economy, distribution of food, change, right here in the city? You know, fortunately, I've been involved with Nazareth House for many, many years, and now with Anne's House. They're 2 homes for homeless people. Well, we have 28 rooms in our new home for women who would be homeless, 28 rooms. We've interviewed over 400 people for those 28 people. What happens to those other girls on the street? We just don't have the services to offer. But who spoke up when Bombardier was given $762 million as a bailout? Do you know how many homes we could build as affordable housing for $762 million? So we're not an equal society. We're not an equal society. But we're supposed to be, as Christians, as Jews, as That's what we're here. We're all human beings and we're all equal. But we don't profess it. We don't live it. We don't put it out in the open because it has repercussions on us. On us. When the church says that we're supposed to be hurting and dirty in the streets, we still live with a sense, and people judge us as being opulent. How do we do all of this and still live with it and still, because I think that's important. We can look at it with pessimism, or we can look at it with hope. I look at it with hope, and I think part of it is because I'm becoming more and more aware that even in the Old Testament, the Hebrew writings, the cosmology that I read in Genesis was a flat earth, columns holding the flat earth, water below, water above, a dome, that the stars were kind of hooked on the dome, and then there were kind of little things like faucets letting the rain come in. Well, that's not the cosmology we have today. When I was growing up, I thought the universe would implode eventually. And now we see that it explodes. There's universes upon universes upon universes upon universes, and they're growing all the time. That's a cosmology that we need to look at. How does that help us interpret Scripture? How does that help us understand the fullness of what that's all about? And with the death of Richard Hawking, all these years looking for the theory of everything. All these years finding out that black holes aren't black holes. But what about the scientific way of seeing that the cosmos, it determines how I live in the world? If the world built universities, the word university comes from universe. How do I, as a student, situate myself in the universe? No longer there. How do I situate myself as a Christian, as a Jew, in a cosmos? If you want to read an interesting book, it's Jeremy Rifkin, The Empathic Civilization. And his last question, after about 900 pages, he says, can we have a biospheric consciousness? Yuval Noah Harari, in his new book, Deus Homo, talking about artificial intelligence. He said the choice will be between intelligence or consciousness. Which will we choose? As Christians, as Jews, as Muslims, I believe that our faith is dependent on our consciousness. If we don't have a consciousness that we live in this incredible world, this big universe, this cosmos, then we become petty people. We become small people. If we live in this cosmos, we have to be big people. We have to take on the big challenges of today's world. That's why we were elected. That's why we were chosen. Thank God we were elected and we were chosen. Thank you very much.
Wow. Every time I hear you teach and speak, I get much more than I anticipate, which is really the beauty of a great teacher and a great preacher and a great scholar. We are really blessed as a community to have teachers like and preachers like Reverend Darrell Gray and like you, John. And I'm blessed having both of you as my friends. And through you, I'm going to meet Ziad Delitz next week. He is coming here next week to do something on Islam and how it relates as well to biblical texts and early texts. I'm going to open up to questions. This was a very scholarly talk, and Bill Freiberg, would you open up the question? Come and stand here.
Yes.
I very much enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
Nice and loud.
I very much enjoyed your talk. I found it lucid, intelligent, very stimulating. You raised some very big questions. And one of them, in fact, I think the one that animates it totally is the question of chosenness and being elected. What exactly do you mean by that? Is it the chosenness or the electedness of a particular people? Is it the chosenness or the electedness of particular individuals? And how do you even reconcile the notion of chosenness or electedness at any particular level, be it of one or two people to the exclusion of others and individuals to the exclusion of others, with the notion of a universal, caring God who is invested in the fate of mankind at large? How can one person or people lay claim to being chosen?
Good question. Next. No, I think your question is very profound, actually, because we all struggle with that. It's a question is, who's chosen? You know?
In your mind, who was chosen? In your talk, whom did you mean as being chosen?
All of us.
All of us being who? The entire world? Everybody in the world?
Humanity was chosen by God.
Ah, okay.
Okay? So once we understand that humanity is why we're here, and the reason why we're here is to better the world. That's why we're chosen. That's why we're elected.
Then the notion is, as the Bible, I'm sorry, I
Huh?
don't get to it, but
Go
the
ahead.
notion is of chosenness, as it emerges from the Old Testament, is one of particularity.
Yes.
This people is chosen. Your view is that humanity is chosen, which is great, but if that is the case, chosen against whom or what? The notion of chosenness ceases with respect to have meaning, because if everyone is chosen, no one is chosen.
In other words, inclusion rather than exclusion.
Precisely.
But particularism of any group that's chosen doesn't take away the universalism of their mission. Of their mission, of what they have to do. Of the group.
But that's mankind's mission.
Well, it's also the Jewish tradition.
It's everyone's mission.
Well, no, but I mean, like when you talk about the Jewish people being chosen, or Christians being chosen, or Muslims being chosen, the chosenness that they can find in their text, and certainly you can see that throughout the Hebrew writings. I mean, God wanted to choose the people of Israel. That's where it started. That's why we end up with one God. I mean, this was a fantastic revelation. But wasn't chosenness and elected not for themselves, by themselves, to be for others. And that's the mission that we all have.
That's fine, but what happens if there's so if everybody is chosen, different groups are chosen.
Yes?
If they're chosen in the same way, then there's a merger of chosenness, and in the end you have one great amalgam of chosenness, which is humanity. The notion of chosenness per se, I suggest, ceases to have any significance.
And one of the things when you talk about chosenness of a specific group of people, we all know that you can say that this is a community, but they could be just a bunch of individuals. They really don't have a sense of unity in that community, common unity. So what you say is true, that it's eventually, how do we move so that humanity respects who humanity is? There was a weak dialogue between Archbishop Tutu and the Dalai Lama. The book is called The Book of Joy. It's really delightful. But at one point, the Dalai Lama says, I had to reach over and take the Archbishop's hand because I knew I was going to scare him. Because he said, you know, Buddhahood and Christianity and Judaism, they might end someday. They're not universalist enough. And he says, but what is universal? Education. Education is universal. And I believe that that's what we need most today, is what you were just saying, is that unless our education involves us in the problems of humanity, then we have become piety. We become a cultic religion. We become confined to our walls of our synagogues and churches and mosques. And that's not at all the spirit in which God has chosen us.
But can't you have all of that, this universal, worthwhile mission and objective in humanity? I'm asking, with whom I'm asking, can you have all of that without God? Is it not possible for mankind to work on these problems, to seek brotherhood and commonality without God?
Dietrich Bonhoeffer, when he was in the concentration camp, said, what will we do with a religionless world? It's a very big question today, because I think that our world is religionless.
Can religion itself become humanity?
Well, I hope it begins there. The traditions that we have are very rich traditions. I mean, when you look at the Jewish tradition, I mean, there's nothing more powerful than what that means for a community, for being chosen and elected. I mean, it's what it's accomplished. It's phenomenal. What Christianity has done is phenomenal. Have we made mistakes? Big mistakes. But hopefully that we can look back at our history and correct what we did that was wrong. I think that the reformers in Islam today, and you'll meet Zia Delis next week, he's a reformer, and you'll see that he has a very open view of how we have to look at the contextualization of the Quran. So like, why are we scared to be human beings? It seems to me that we have to begin there. And, we're writing a new human narrative right now. Our history is being changed dramatically. The way we look at human beings has changed dramatically. Artificial intelligence is going to change us dramatically. The fact that we live in a world of internet and phenomenal communication or possibility of communication is changing us dramatically as human beings. If we have to make that choice between intelligence and consciousness, I would choose consciousness.
Can't we have both?
Well, not if you leave me being an algorithm. I want to be more than an algorithm. Well, that's what artificial intelligence becomes.
We're flesh and blood as well.
Well, no, but that's where consciousness is. Intelligence is fine, but when artificial intelligence is more intelligent than we are as a human being, will we still have consciousness that we are human beings? Will we still have this consciousness of other human beings? Will we still have consciousness of taking on the responsibility of helping other human beings? I think those are vital questions today. And they're really, they're happening everywhere. Paul? Oh. Back there and Paul.
One of the things I'm gathering from this about chosenness is that, we've always been the Jews, the chosen people. Well, maybe other people were also chosen, and it's not an exclusive chosenness that we have, because we're not the only chosen people. And each community may have been chosen for some of the same stuff and to do some different stuff. But we all have our work to do.
The particularism is that there's things that you have gifts for that I don't have, just like a human being. That's why if I had all the gifts, I would be obnoxious.
And the other thing is, can we be chosen without also choosing God?
Oh, sure. I think you have to look at, there are people today who have become, quote unquote, atheists. They have no sense of God.
They do, they just don't admit it.
Well, not that facile. But my friend Gord Sinclair and I used to go twice a year, and the professed atheist that he was, and we'd always end up with something about religion and God. And I often say to Gord, the God you don't believe in, I don't believe in him either. I must be an atheist. Because what do we want God to be? Do we want him to be what we are, or are we made in his image and likeness? If we're made in his image and likeness, then look at that. And I look around. The closest I'm going to see the face of God is right here. Your faces and the faces of people that you face every day, and the people we face in the world. Somewhere we have to be able to bring it back to our humanity, and to our humanity that's blessed by God. And the more, if we're living in an information age and have no ability to have God in our agricultural world, and not in an industrialized world, what is he going to be for us? Today, for me, God's love comes to us through a human heart. The gentler that human heart, the kinder, more open it is, then I will begin to see God here. I can't see him anywhere else. He's not a spooky God. It's a God that comes to me so he's touchable and tangible and real. He's able to transform people and see it. I see people every day that are changed because of what we do with them, how we deal with them, how we make them smile, how, I have a friend of mine, she's going through a terrible time with her daughter. And I stopped by and, the first thing, thanks for the visit, I needed it desperately. What did I do? I didn't do anything, I listened. So, I think that's what we have to, we're human beings. Before we were Jews, Christians, or anybody, he made us from the earth. It's a God of the earth. B'nai Adam, It's not B'nai Hashamayim, you know? B'nai Adam, we're men and women of the earth. Paul. Come.
I wanted to get to something a little bit more practical, I guess. And you talked about the dwindling amount of people who are going to church. And we certainly see it as churches become condominiums. And, we struggle here certainly in maintaining membership and trying to find new ways to engage people. But you talked about how, all right, kid, be quiet, do this, do that. I grew up listening to my parents mostly. And I follow those traditions and I take them along with me. Where do you find the balance between maintaining those traditions and listening to the younger and engaging the younger generations? And I mean, it applies, I think, beyond religion. It applies to almost anything that we do. You can apply it to the game of golf if you want as well, right?
I need lots of help there.
I would be a sports
Again, Paul, it's a question that I've asked myself many times. I might have shocked people when I preached and said, everything my parents believed, I no longer believe. Everything they believed, I don't believe anymore. And I don't say that, but they loved me enough to let me not believe what they believed. And I think they believed of a church that was very hierarchical. They believed that the church was to have the priest as shorn of his sexuality and an elitist group of people. I don't believe that anymore. I don't believe that we are better off because we're Catholics as opposed to Anglicans or Presbyterians. They did, I don't. So many, I say all, yeah, probably all that they believed I no longer believe. And I've had to work to believe in something else. And I believed in it because I think I'm listening to young people. We don't use their language. We don't understand their language sometimes, but we don't use it in our homilies, in our sermons. We still use language that doesn't really speak to them. Most of the young people that I know who are, when I was doing confirmations, the best letter was, "Dear Father Walsh, I'm really, really happy that you're going to confirm me next week so then I can leave the church." Because we have that sense in which you got everything that it could give you, because then you come back and get married. When the couples come to see me to get married, they say, "I've made my sacraments," I was baptized, confirmed, made my first communion, blah. And I said, "When did you leave the church?" "Well, I was about 14. "How old are you now?" "I mean, your faith hasn't grown from the age of 14 to 28. Sometimes their faith doesn't grow until they're 88, So, I think what we pass on is not so much as what we have to challenge the young people so that they will have something to pass on. And it won't be what I said. It'll be what they have really come to experience. Their experience of the world is, I don't know anybody over 50, maybe over 40, who can keep up with the 8-year-old on any of the iBox games, It's just, there's another world. When my nephew was about 12, I had a new stereo set, and I was having trouble putting it together, and he did it in 10 minutes. It's just another world. It's not only ability, it's the way they see the world. And we don't have their language, and we have to have their language. We don't have a choice. So when you listen more and more to young people today, we just had the election of the Queen of the Parade, and I was there at the evening that the young lady was chosen. They had 12 candidates. I say, did anybody listening to these young people? These are 12 young ladies going to be queen at the parade next Sunday. And like the St. Patrick's Day parade. And I'm finishing my master's at McGill. And last Sunday I was in Rwanda for the summer. I was doing this, and on the weekends I helped the handicapped or the mentally challenged kids in my YMCA around the corner. And then I'm writing a little story for, do you have 8 days in a week? And these people are absolutely brilliant in terms of being able to use their time constructively and to do it to help other people. And yet they're smiling, they're happy. I'm really impressed with young people. People are down on young people. I think that the best generation that we've had is the generation that we have today, the young generation. They're conscious of the world. When I was growing up, I didn't know any Jews. We didn't have many blacks in our community in the north end of the city. That's not true today. I was told that, literally that Protestants were going to hell, Jews were going to heaven. Today, the young people are just, I don't care if you're a Jew. Who are you? I don't care if you're a Catholic. It's okay with me. But don't tell me who you are. Just, can we do this? We're having a supper to help the people who don't have any food, and we're going to prepare a supper. Will you give me a hand? And they get people to together, make a meal, serve it, have fun. So that's where God is. God isn't in some distant place. Jacques Maritain, the great Catholic philosopher, says, the day that he realized there aren't two worlds, a supernatural world and a natural world, and we aren't disunited between the two. And that's why I think that the whole idea of God intervening and theism hasn't worked. And today we call it panentheism, that God is in the world is in God. And what we do to this world is how we will find God. And young people do that, except we don't know how to tell them that that's God. It is. It's a wonderful God. It's a real God. It's a God that touches other people's lives. It's a God, and if he's this big, and he can come to me in little snippets, I couldn't take him all like that. I mean, he would bowl me over, this God that was this infinite God. I couldn't cope with him. But little snippets, somebody, when I saw you walk in tonight, I said, oh, that's nice. I didn't expect to see you. That to me is a moment of recognition, a moment of, and when you introduced me to your mom, that's another recognition. And Lionel and our relationship, and that's God. That's God. That's everything God wants to be. And God, if you read the scriptures, is a God of history. He's in all of the good things and the bad things that we did. He's there. He's helping us. He's the outstretched arm. He's leading us out of slavery. He's, did they see him at the crossing of the Red Sea? No. But the Pharaoh's men damn well knew that God was not on their side. So, yes.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk, Father John. I've heard you speak before at the Reform Show. And I wonder whether, there's two questions. One is whether this sort of personal way you have of re-articulating and reformulating praise, and also praising of reformulating faith and theology, are you formalizing that and entering into a dialogue with your church and your hierarchy and with the sort of church community of the Catholic Church? And the other thing I wanted to point out, and I guess there's two more things, is one is that you're praising the youth that isn't attending church or perhaps other institutions of faith, or some are and some aren't. So why is that? And with that re-articulation of faith, that re-articulation of theology in a language that speaks to today, it's not taking away the basis or the core, but this re-articulation, this re-understanding of theology that is shared in many faiths that are 2,000 years old, and where words were articulated to connect to a world that was incredibly different, that re-articulation of faith must be so essential. You're doing it in a personal way. You've told us about it here. Is this something you plan on formalizing? And the second question is, you said refer to the church as a mother. So if the church is a mother, why aren't the women who are serving not bishops and archbishops and popes? So we have that issue in Judaism as well. Is the selection or the chosenness of women different from the chosenness of men? Is the baptism of women different from the chosenness of men? And would this be what Jesus Christ would have wanted?
Again, but if that's the last question, I can be here for another 2 days. But your questions are very, very pointed. I'll begin with saying that what you said about our patriarchal, paternalistic structure in our society has certainly given no place for women that would be a respectable place for women. We still live in a church that's structured with patriarchal, paternalistic structure. Until that changes, and Pope Francis is trying desperately to change that. He calls himself the Bishop of Rome because he says that the bishops of the world that are in a college of bishops, and decentralizing the church, putting it back into the parish and into the local conferences of bishops. I mean, he's doing that. I mean, it's evident.
I have faith in Pope Francis.
Okay, but so until that structure in our society, I mean, we've gone through it recently with all this stuff that's going on in sexual harassment and you name it, and that's come out of a structure and out of a culture and out of a society. It's changing. Will it change overnight? Probably not, but it's changing rapidly. The church is changing rapidly. Will all the bishops overnight get the idea with the light bulb go on and they say, "Whoa, wow, that's great"? No. Will all priests get it overnight? No. But if you have, thank God I have a virtual community too, where I hear from bishops and I read all that's being done in the conferences in Africa, and you see that this is happening everywhere in the world in the Catholic Church. With regards to, the youth today don't have the hang-ups we had. Ours was, the biggest virtue I could have as a child was to be obedient, not to dissent from anything my parents said, not to dissent to anything the authority said. But there's such a thing as loyal dissent and questioning. And I think that the young people, in their loyal dissent and in their questioning, are opening us to answers that we didn't think would be possible. So yes, it's possible.
I don't think that seeking the path towards truth is dissent. It appears to be dissent because it's actually a correction of something that's wrong.
I'm not arguing with you. I'm just complimenting you in terms of saying that what we have to do is listen to young people, because they have opened up venues and ways of being able to see things that I never thought of before. And in terms of interpreting Scripture, there's the Pontifical Biblical Commission, and they produce an 80-page document. I know most people won't read it, but what they talk about is feminist interpretation. So people would say in one particular part where the woman comes and stands beside him. I didn't see that as a liberation of women, but women exegetes see that as a moment when Jesus liberates people to stand up and be beside him. And I wouldn't have seen that. Women see things I would never see. And so it's impossible to say that young people are there to open us. And what I'm going to terminate the question is that we were church-centered, and now we're kingdom-centered. And the reign of God that we have to build together is a reign in which we're going to find justice rather than injustice. We're going to find mercy rather than judgment. And we're going to find love rather than unlove. And we're going to find peace in the world. And if we can do that, then I think we fulfill the God I believe in.
Father John, take a seat. You have stood too long. You preach what I know Catholics refer to as the social gospel. It is certainly a gospel, and I use that in the broadest sense of the word, that appeals to young men and women across religious and national boundaries. When we see the young students at Parkland forming a movement to control guns in the United States, to march on Washington, when we see that Jews and Christians alike and Muslims stand up together on that one issue which is so prevalent in the United States, we see that social gospel. You and I both know and have read Abraham Joshua Heschel. And Heschel talks about God seeking man. God needs us to do God's work. While we may not recognize that the work that you and I and the people who walk with us and people who aren't even walking with us or don't know that they're walking with us do, we are doing what God wants us to do. And Bill, you said, do we really need, I think it was you, Bill, who said, do we really need God in this?
And how do we know what God wants us to do? It's what we want to do, what we should do.
It's what we as human beings, what we as human beings imagine that if God were speaking to us as I'm speaking to you, what God would be saying to us. And it changes.
But in that sense, God, I'm sorry, you're right. God is a projection from us of our better angels, our best instincts, the best that there is in us. That's what I thought I heard that it's the good in everything, and that it's the good in the totality of things, and there's God in that.
So Mordechai Kaplan, which
And yes, it's coherent, but that being the case, how do you worship that? And how do you build, is that thing, that force, something that is interested in us, or is it us projecting that and saying it exists and it's wonderful and we should perpetuate it, but it's us, we're making it happen. It's not-
I just leave you with, if you're at a wonderful party and you take your glass and you say, L'chaim, to life. I wish we could do that in our synagogues, that we would feel so close to each other, we'd all stand up and say, to life. Because that's what we are, it's to live our life to the fullest, the best.
That's true, but perhaps you can do that without something called God out there.
Absolutely, and I know people who do it without God, and just as good people as I am, maybe better. In fact, most of them are better. But that doesn't take away the fact that I believe in God. But the God I believe in is not necessarily the God that everybody else believes in. That's why we need community. Pulling it away. There's good religion and there's bad religion, but the good religion is always trying to push away the bad religion. And that's the same thing with God.
So how do you build an institutional religion that celebrates that?
Well, that's why, or let's not have restorationism, but let's have real revolution, because it needs change.
I hate to interrupt, but Efimio just tells me here that they're ticketing in front of the shul. So if your car is parked à ce côté de la rue ou à l'autre côté? À l'autre côté. If you're parked on the other side of Côte St. Luc Road, we will regret your absence, but move your car.
Too late.
okay?
And if you have a ticket, just go to the office tomorrow and
Right. I'm going to send it to God. I will thank you once again, and on behalf of all of us, for a stimulating evening. I invite you all to some refreshments, some light refreshments that we have every week. Invite you back next week, all of us, when Imam Ziad Delitz is here from Ottawa. He will use another biblical text as his pretext for teaching. And that text is the sacrifice of Isaac. Sorry? I understand. But in the biblical text, it is the near sacrifice of Isaac. So we will, and it's actually, as I looked it up in the Quran today, it's actually the near sacrifice of Isaac as well. Yep. Yes, it's in that is what it is but we'll let the Imam teach that to us, and the implications of that for our mutual religions and our understanding. Thanks again. Join us.
Ya tú te puedes arriba, toma la llave. No, está bien, sí, solo de abajo está prendido. Pero voy a pasar allí la comida y después lo voy a poner aquí otra vez. Ven, para que hable. No te apures, vete. Ya vete. thé, décaféiné irrégulier. Oui, no problem.
Allowed to show up.